What I want to talk about is some work that we are doing in Manchester with the University of Manchester, and what they asked us to do, which was essentially to do a bit of research on what was going on with various kinds of research parks around the world. So I'm just going to present that. So this is a fairly factual kind of information feed. Any of you who were at the presentation I did this morning will know that I'm big on this. I think this is a really important thing for you to be thinking about for the bays, because essentially this is where the world is going, and a number of cities are moving at this very aggressively. I'm going to talk about those 6 topics, so 5 cities, and then some interesting kind of alternative ways of thinking about this. But I realized that one of the reasons that we started doing this work was, in fact, a city which isn't here, which is one of your chief rivals, which is Singapore. It is quite extraordinary when you go to Singapore, quite how smart they are in a tremendous number of areas. And any of you, who's familiar with Biopolis? Okay, so what the city of Singapore have done is essentially to, the city of Singapore, the state of Singapore, they conveniently, any of you who are in the governance discussion knows that the best way to have a city is actually just to have one country. This is a city, and then everything works perfectly, especially if it's only yay big. What Singapore realized was that they needed to quite aggressively move into the knowledge economy world. They developed a project called Biopolis, and Biopolis is essentially a government-developed campus in which they are essentially inducing and seducing companies and researchers in the biomedical field to come in. It has been an enormous success, and they're now, I think, close to 2 million square feet of this space. They then decided what they wanted to do was develop, excuse me, some other lines of business. So they developed something called Nanopolis, nanotechnology. And Nanopolis is now just beginning to take off. They've started to get the first buildings going on that. And exactly the same strategy. They're very deliberately going and buying talent and companies. And there are various kinds of tax incentives that go with that. So not satisfied with that, they decided they would go into the next one. Who can guess what? If you do Biopolis, Nanopolis, the next one is Fusionopolis. Fusionopolis is essentially materials science. This is the area that is essentially going to revolutionize everything that we use and manufacture from over the next few generations. And that is also the spark of why Manchester asked us to go, because Manchester is one of the leading places for materials science. The city of Manchester, to give you an idea, the University of Manchester is in the foreground here. It's down essentially a main street that leads out from the city centre, very close to the city centre. And what they asked us to look at, so you can see here the city centre, the green is the university campus, and the north campus was an area of tired old 60s college buildings that they really wanted to redevelop as a science cluster. So we've been working with them, and it's also very conveniently right next to Piccadilly Station, which is the main line station for Manchester, which is about to be the recipient of an HS2, high-speed 2 line. Any of you who are in the London and Continental Railways will know they're developing that. So the accessibility of this site suddenly gets to be an hour and a half from, an hour and 15 minutes from London. We did a lot of thinking about exactly those connections of where this site was in relation to the city centre from a pedestrian point of view and from an access point of view, and then started to develop what might be a layout. There's a wonderful old stream riverbed that we decided we could excavate, and essentially we saw that we could get about somewhere between 2.5 and 3 million square feet of new mixed-use research, university, office, and residential space in a new combination. So what are the things that the university is interested in doing there? They are interested in the development of graphene. Now, who knows what graphene is? Okay, well, you're all going to know what graphene is. Graphene is a carbon atom, a carbon product which is 1 atom thick. Just think about that. And as the researchers who both won Nobel Prizes for the discovery or the development of graphene at the University of Manchester will tell you, graphene is so strong that an elephant in high heels can dance on it, even though it's only 1 atom thick. It's going to be the thing that essentially your cell phone will suddenly become as thick as a Kleenex. All kinds of materials, planes are going to be made out of graphene. Graphene is fantastic at desalination as a filter. All kinds of products. So what is happening is there is an explosion of patents all over the world. And what the University of Manchester is trying to do with this complex is essentially capture those patents. So this is the first building in the National Graphene Institute. It's funded by the national government, and it is an incubator. And the trick here, which I have to say has not quite happened yet, even though the building is basically just opened, is the commercialization, what I talked about this morning of the translation of brains into smarts. But there is every reason to believe that this is going to be a very major part of the economy of Manchester. Essentially what we're looking at here is the new silicon. At the same time, the university is trying to develop other buildings, City Labs buildings. These are more conventional biomedical buildings that are related to, in the university corridor, are also a couple of the major teaching hospitals. And they are now trying to do the trick that is, again, all hospitals are trying to do, which is to translate their hospital and university research into commercialized activity. And this, again, is being a significant success. So we're beginning to see in Manchester a real reinvention of the city as a leading-edge technology hub. Manchester always likes to say it was the first industrial city, and it's now trying to be the first post-industrial city. I'm not going to talk about this because someone else is going to talk about this, but I do want to say 2 things about it. First of all, doesn't Roosevelt Island look like Glebe Island? It's exactly the same shape, and it's got a bridge flying over the top of it. Frankly, if you wanted to put your money down now on what is a smart thing to be really thinking about for Glebe Island, it's something very close to this. Just so for those of you who don't know where Roosevelt Island is, we're looking at the United Nations right here, right on the prow of Roosevelt Island. And what's critically important in all of these locations is where are you in relation to the university and the hospital, which may actually be a critical, or hospitals, which may be a critical question in terms of the bays. Again, I'm not going to go through this, but just take, why did they do this? The last bullet. New York realized that it was not competitive. It's amazing for New York to realize it's not competitive, but it realized it was not competitive in biomedical, in applied research. There are other centers in New York which there's an interesting company called Alexandria that has been developing these biomedical research complexes in association with hospitals. There's one here, there's one in Boston, there's one in Mission Bay, and there's one in Toronto. And there is, as it were, beginning to be a development opportunity that private sector partners are recognizing in terms of the ability to sidle up to hospitals, do what the hospitals can't do, which is essentially to provide things which aren't their core business, which are these commercial research spaces, and essentially take the commercial real estate risk for that. It's all very much dependent upon the quality of the hospital and quality of the university to make sure that these things happen. But the other critical element in commercialization is the presence of venture capital and of the professional services that are actually able to do that translation from brains to smarts. Obviously, in New York City, you don't have any problem with that. The granddaddy of these research parks is probably the University Park in MIT. This was developed in the 80s, probably almost, I think, the first of research parks. It's gone through a tremendous number of ups and downs in its cycle, which is another thing that anybody engaged in this has to understand. Initially, it was set up with all of the great enthusiasm that this was going to be. Again, we've got the hospitals and the university. The Red Star is where the University Research Park is. The great enthusiasm that this was, all of a sudden, all of this commercialization of research was going to happen. It didn't happen, so they turned half the buildings into residential. So there is a huge real estate risk that goes along with a lot of these developments. And also, there's a huge cyclical risk. They are not at all easy propositions to get off the ground from a commercial perspective. There were a lot of favors that Cambridge, Mass, the city in which this is located, gave them in terms of special zoning privileges, etc., because clearly this was a very needed thing to do. Kendall Square, which is on the other side of MIT, also on the Charles River. This is a plan that we did for the private developer of this. It's, I think, a very successful regeneration. This is an old gasworks site with a nice canal coming in off the Charles River. It has turned into a very significant success. This is the Genentech building, which is the first building up. This is a green platinum building. I think it was the first green platinum LEED platinum building in the U.S. In some ways, it's almost become, again, so the Red Star is on the other side of MIT there, it's almost become a bit of a victim of its own success. It's actually got to be a very expensive place now. That part of Cambridge has developed to an extent that, in fact, residential and other activities start to be competitive with these research activities. We talked about Mission Bay this morning. This is a really interesting project. This, as I said, was the catalyst which essentially revivified a essentially dormant large-scale redevelopment project. This is why universities are so useful in terms of their as regeneration engines, because essentially they have an independent source of funding, and they can proceed counter-cyclically. We were lucky in Toronto to have our academic building proceed right in the teeth of the recession. And this comes along with a series of R&D buildings. I think there are 2, again, developed by Alexandria right now, with another 3 possibly going to happen. This was, again, set up in a special tax district, all kinds of benefits that were created in terms of enterprise zone benefits. All of these projects are induced, they're force-fed, they all have to have some kind of real pump and push behind them, or they're not going to happen from a taxation perspective. This is really seeming to be taking off and is a big success, and now the residential, commercial, retail, and all the other things are going to happen, so the larger development is a success. This is Toronto MARS, which stands for the Medical and Related Sciences Discovery District. This is a wonderful old hospital building that has been restored. This is the original Toronto General Building, and then in behind that, a whole first phase was developed. Again, the green triangles are the university, the purple lozenges are the hospitals, and interestingly, right here is the state or provincial legislature. So you're right in the nexus of government, academic, hospital activity. There's kind of a bit of a myth, I think it's a myth, that doctors finish doing their surgery and then rush out to their offices in the research complex. That these distances have to be walkable. I'm not sure whether that's true or not, but it's not accidental that nearly all these biomedical research complexes are very, very closely cheek by jowl with their hospitals. This is a 1.4 million in the first phase, and a brand new, beautiful tower has been opened, I guess, about a year ago. The only problem is there aren't any tenants. And this has caused a big political crisis for the government, because essentially the government had to backstop it. It also, there were kind of problems that rolled on from the recession that weren't properly resolved. And eventually Alexandria, the developer I referenced before, had to get bought out. So again, this is not stuff for the faint of heart. Why this went wrong, not quite sure, but one of the things I suspect that it went wrong is that you build a custom research building, and you've got to have super high floors, you've got to have special oxygen, you've got to have filtered water, you've got to have all kinds of venting and flues and stuff like this. You get up to $70 a foot. It's not clear that the market will bear that. And the other thing is, as in all market circumstances, there will be competition. What's happened is a couple of the hospitals that are actually not in the University Health Network, sort of the Catholic hospitals that nobody ever thinks about where you're going to have a baby, well, maybe they will produce some decent research space as well at a half of the rent. So that has caused a lot of trouble in this project. So those are the biomedical. I think it's important that nearly all the projects that are currently in line for this kind of knowledge transfer from pure science into applied science have been biomedical in the past. When you talk to the people who run these places, they say, that's over. Nothing is biomedical, nothing is mechanical, nothing is materials. It's all information technology. Everything is really digital. The skill in these, if you're running some huge genome test, this is not medicine. This is information technology. And so this is actually the skill set that you need. So if you have that view, then things actually perhaps change a little. Maybe you don't need all that filtered water and oxygen and all the rest of the stuff. So there is kind of a low-tech version that is beginning to emerge in a number of cities, which is quite interesting. This is Tech City in Shoreditch. Tech City is not a city, it's a network of companies. This is, I think, about 1,200 companies. These are their Twitter feeds all connecting each other. They just decided, let's all get together and create a research network. So they're all jammed into old buildings in East London, but their critical mass is essentially in this very informal network that has been put together digitally. Very low rent space, at least it used to be very low rent space. Now, of course, demand is pushing it up there. Google and a few other big people have gone in here to pump this. So this is really beginning to take off. Again, a lot of government pumping, pushing, priming in behind that. This is that, what I showed you before here, I should say, this is known as Silicon Roundabout. This is a big roundabout in the middle of East London. Okay. And then I think there's even a lower tech version again. I mean, this is the loft culture. Every city has got tons and tons of lofts. And if you really want to know where the new knowledge economy is located, it is essentially in buildings like this. I mean, we've got exactly what I'm looking at here in this whole technology center. Because this brick and beam, this is super cheap, super flexible, and essentially this kind of space, this is one just down the street from our office in Toronto. It's largely an arts and media and digital incubation facility. And they've got gardens on the roof and vegan restaurants and all the other equipment that's absolutely essential for a place like this. And it's thriving. The other fascinating thing that the people who run it tell me, that was quite hilarious, I think, is that their great successful business model, because young artists, young entrepreneurs always pay their rent. It's big business who stiff you on the rent. So in fact, these work very successfully. There's also another model which is quite interesting, which is the big modern shed. I talked about this morning. This is the old media center of the Olympics in London. And essentially, this is full of containers like this behind us, which are turned into offices. That's in that East London. We talked about Stratford, which is just at the top of the slide. And this is this new university park happening down below. So there's a whole knowledge hub being spawned by this whole drift of the city to the east. Very successful way of kind of managing the growth of the city, which London always went to the west. It's really been turned around now in a quite fascinating way. And this is 1.2 million square feet of flexible commercial media space, and it's doing very well commercially. There's another one in Manchester. This is an old television factory, Sharp Electronics. And inside this, again, what do you have? Essentially completely bare bones, cables hanging out of the roof. You plug in your container. You can rent it for a day, a week, a month, a year, 2 containers, 3 containers, half a container, and big ping pong tables in the middle. And again, I always love the fact here that the unique piece of the biggest success they've had in terms of digital commercialization here is someone who's developed a program to delete from the entire internet world, the entire cloud, all of those photographs of yourself which you shouldn't really have taken. And so that is going to be a very big app, I suspect. And again, this is quite remote from the center of Manchester, and that again is a big problem, and it's something we have to worry about for the bays, because these kinds of places work on foot. And nobody has a car in big cities. None of the people in my office have cars anymore. They bike, they walk, they transit, and so if you're a long way off the ice, sorry, that's a Canadian term. If you're a long way from center ice, it's kind of tricky to make these things work, and that's going to be something that we have to worry about in the bays. But again, 200,000 square feet of flexible office space, so successful that they're actually beginning to clone this right now. And there is a real community of digital entrepreneurs, and it's actually producing the goods. There are some, and again, I'm not going to steal Thomas's thunder here, but there are some non-place ways of doing this as well. Take the helm. Basically, this is a wonderful program in Manhattan, just essentially running a competition every year for startups, and the winner gets $250,000. And also gets all kinds of connections to all of that old Wall Street office space that really doesn't have a future use. So I'll let Thomas speak about that more, because I don't want to steal his thunder. But you can see how successful that has been in terms of the bump in square feet and the bump in employees in the TAMI, which is Technology, Advertising, Media, and Information Industries. So I started this off because it was health and science researchers. As I said before, health science, biomedical is too limiting a term. Everything is now digital technology. The relationships, certainly of the higher order knowledge industries to the universities and to the hospitals, seems to be really very critical. The development economics are tricky. You have to force feed, you have to pump prime, and the risk allocation is scary. In Toronto, we got left basically with a very expensive baby. We should be really looking in the bays at low-tech alternatives, because we got all of the stock. I mean, the powerhouse building is just a perfect opportunity for the kinds of things that we've seen here and on the slides. And these really are very positive, creative engines of regeneration. Thank you very much.